I'm not going to cover all 6 episodes because 3 recent ones have been very quick, in quick succession. But I think you will get a sense of what the issues are if we just look at the first 3. So the first graph over there shows you what has happened in the first 3 IMF programs since the 3 first IMF programs since 2000. Every time IMF has been asked to help out, it's because our current account deficit was completely off the charts, and we were facing a severe balance of payments problem. The IMF came, we were able to stabilize, IMF engagement became less intensive, and within a year or so, we were back into the crisis. And you will see this trend very clearly in this graph. The green bit is when the IMF is engaged. And you will see an improvement in the current account deficit. The IMF begins to disengage, and we are back to square one. Now, this has had severe consequences of the sort that Melia Lodi was talking about, which is that we've become an extremely weak economy, which affects everything, which affects our foreign policy stance, it affects our ambitions as a middle power, it affects our bilateral relations. And so let's begin to see how that transpires. It immediately transpires in terms of slowing down of growth. IMF programs will result in slowing down of growth. That's how the programs are structured, because we can get into a balance of payments problem because we're growing either too fast, the demand is very high, the IMF program comes and says, you've got to curtail demand. When that happens, growth slows down, which is why we should have IMF programs periodically, very, very rarely, and not as frequently as we have them. Because slowing down of growth is an inevitable consequence of an IMF program. And we are seeing that with the 3 programs. If I were to put in the next 3 programs, you will see that our growth continues to slow down throughout this period. This has serious implications. Job creation in the country is largely in the informal sector. There is very little formal job creation. The captains of industry who are sitting here, you are responsible largely for formal job creation. There is very little formal job creation. Most of the job creation is in the informal sector, which has implications for standards of living for people. And the next graph shows that. I'm just giving you a comparison with India. You can see that right up to the 1990s, income per capita in Pakistan was higher than in India. Since then, India has caught up. Now income per capita is substantially higher in India than in Pakistan. And if the current trends continue, our income per capita will be less than half India's. And that will put us in an even weaker position when it comes to bilateral relations. This is a very scary graph, which I've sometimes tried to show to the security establishment. What it means when India spends 1% of GDP on education, which is great, but on defense, which is not so great, compared to what happens when Pakistan spends 1% of GDP. If you slow down the growth, India's 1% will fetch far, far more than our 1%. So this whole question of security parity becomes nonsensical. Okay, now, we've seen that our instability, our inability to check the current account deficit in a sustainable way has severe consequences in terms of standards of living over time when we do it frequently, and which means that stabilization alone is not enough. We've done that before. We've done that many times. I've just shown you 3 episodes. I can show you the next 2 also, and you'll see the same results. We know what to do to achieve stability. we don't know what to do to stay out of trouble. And that means structural reform. And structural reform is not just the government. Mr. Malik emphasized that it's not just the government, it's us, it's really this lot. Structural reform is about how investments take place in the country and what we produce. If we are going to produce largely for the domestic market, living off the froth of remittances, $32 billion a year remittances is a lot of froth. Instead of focusing on global markets, which could be to the tune of $400, $500 billion, if we don't make that shift, we will not have the structures that we need for the economy to come out of the boom and bust cycles. Now, I'm going to cut the story short because we have to engage with our panelists here. The key to restructuring the economy and the key to restructuring the investments that the captains of industry incur is going to be productivity growth. And there's a very simple reason. I started to look at data put out by the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics on what is happening to wage trends. My assumption was that frequent balance of payments crisis, frequent loss of value in the rupee has resulted in a substantial reduction of real wages. I was shocked to see the results. The labor force survey shows that the increase in nominal wages throughout this period for all categories of skilled workers in the formal sector, the increase in nominal wages has been far higher than inflation. So real wages have in fact been going up. And real wages have been going up has very serious implications of how you will have your recovery. Real wages have been going up because as far as our skilled workers are concerned, they have access to overseas labor markets. Remittances come in, that increases the reservation wage. I've tested it out with anecdotal evidence also from people, household servants, everywhere. Real wages have gone up. The only way to have deep structural reform when real wages are rising is if you have productivity growth. The World Bank has done an excellent report on productivity growth. We should all look at it, not just the government, but also the private sector. And we should see what needs to be done for us to catch up with productivity growth of the likes of Vietnam, et cetera. So I'm going to stop there. This is by way of context. Now let's get the real experts to give their views. I'm going to first start with our journalist friend, Khurram Husain, because his job is to look for the early signs of whether things are improving or whether things are deteriorating. And I'm going to ask Khurram to tell us a little bit about what those early signs are that he's looking for and what those early signs are telling us.
Thanks, Ijaz. The early signs at this point would be fatigue with the stabilization that's been underway since at least July of 2023. Now, your graphs tell us one very important thing that they're telling us that you didn't point out, but is worth pointing out, is that this is not the first time that we are going through this experience of applying the brakes on our economy in order to extinguish the current account deficit, in order to extinguish the primary balance, the deficits on the fiscal and the primary accounts, and in order to curb inflation. We've done it since over the past quarter century, we have done it 1 to 3 times at least, this being the 4th, or if we count 2 other occasions, then it becomes a 6th. But at least 4 times. So, having been through it so many times, we have learned that some things happen during these periods or these episodes of stabilization that are common. And what one does is one starts looking for those signs. And one of those is that a clamor begins from within the business community to start unwinding the stabilization. They come back and they start asking through their organized bodies the chambers of commerce or organized bodies such as this one, the OICCI, and the various citywide chambers of commerce, and then the industry associations like APTMA start speaking up and saying that interest rates need to be brought down, and if they are coming down, they need to be brought down much more sharply than they are. And they start asking for either the resumption of or the introduction of subsidized energy schemes, subsidized credit schemes, and sector-specific tax breaks. That's now beginning. So to give an example, for the past X number of days, the Sialkot Chamber of Commerce has been putting out a demand to provide the property sector and the real estate sector with targeted tax breaks. And they're saying eliminate the FED, eliminate this, eliminate. They've got an entire list laid out over there. The Federation of Pakistan Chambers of Commerce and Industry is demanding sharper interest rate cuts. And they've got their own sort of mathematics that they put behind it, saying that, well, in India and China, why don't we index our interest rates to their interest rates, and things like that. But nevertheless, and after yesterday's, or this Monday's monetary policy announcement, they've come out with a very angry statement saying that, you know, you've got to like cut sharper and whatnot. So this clamor is something to watch for, number one. Number two, the thing to watch for is how is the clamor being received within the government? Are they receiving it with a stoic sort of a poise and with patience and saying, well, guys, I'm glad you need all that, I'm glad you're asking for all that, but we can't afford it at this point? Or are they now beginning to sort of buckle and shake? Is their resolve beginning to wobble a little bit? And what I'm seeing these days is, I think to some extent, weariness with the ongoing stabilization, to some extent, and this is something I have anecdotally from conversations with chartered accountants in Pakistan, in Karachi, the city that I live and work in, that many of the businesses that are clamoring for unwinding the stabilization are actually doing rather well. Their cash flows are actually repairing compared to where they were a year or 2 years ago. So the place from where these businessmen are coming is not really a place of trying to improve the economy or get growth going. It's a place of greed. They're making money, they want to make more money. That's what it is. That's what the demand is for in reality. But how is the government receiving this? Are they finding more and more of an increasingly receptive ear? And you see that in the government's efforts, if more and more efforts are directed towards trying to gratify or satisfy these demands while staying within the confines of the IMF program, then you'll know that they are that their resolve is weakening. And the only way the government can actually now, I think, graduate out of stabilization into growth is to present a clear and credible vision or an agenda for change, an agenda for reforms. Now they've presented one, it's called Uran Pakistan. Frankly, I'm unconvinced by it. It's all over the place, in my view. It's trying to do too much, and it doesn't really count as a clear or a credible agenda for reforms. It seems to have very weak ownership within the government itself. I don't hear many people from within government in senior positions talking about it, invoking its various sections or anything. And, but other than that, there's not much else. So yeah, things are wobbly. That's where we're standing. And my eyes would be focused on seeing whether the wobble increases or whether the government sort of pulls together and brings things under control.
So in terms of the context-setting numbers I gave, the reason why we end up back into crisis is because there is this clamor for growth without the economy having restructured. Within the old structures, we grow and we have the same outcomes, which is again a balance of payments crisis. So it's this changing of the structures of the economy with the structural reform that the IMF keeps talking about, and I'm going to look forward to our panelists to elaborate on that. The structural reform that's critical is to arrest this decline in export to GDP ratio. Pakistan had the highest export to GDP ratio in South Asia until 2000. After that, we have now become the lowest export to GDP ratio. A lot of productivity growth will happen simply if we move back to being the leaders of, in terms of exports for the region. That's a critical restructuring that we need to do. Clamoring for growth, clamoring for removing the foot from the pedal before we've undertaken this restructuring will put us back. That comes out of what Khurram has just said. Let me now turn to our friend Binici, who will tell us a little bit about how IMF is thinking about whether this is going to be one more installment of IMF engagement in Pakistan, or what will it take for it to be the final installment, and why he disagrees with the early interpretations of the early signs that Khurram sees.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me, and also for setting an excellent stage for discussion, and Mr. Husain for his intervention. So probably it would be useful if I kind of, say a few things why maybe this time is different, and from the fund perspective and our program, and also highly likely that would address some of the concern that's been raised. So as you have already mentioned that, we had kind of like this series of the fund program that mainly, and this is not only in Pakistan, across the board, that, typically the fund program would start when there is a crisis, and mainly driven by balance of payments and kind of like issues related to the external position. And what makes the new program is different, because, I mean, the new arrangement, of course, this was approved on September 25 by the IMF board. And this really kind of like started from the lessons they were learned from the past decade of the fund program itself. And then with that background, there are like three points that I can highlight. One of them is the initial condition. The second one of them is the role of provinces. And the third point is about the growth agenda. The first point is that, as I mentioned, the typical programs, they start with the crisis. But the kind of like the crisis situation or the stabilization was already addressed partially by the previous program that we had last year with this 9-month standby arrangement, so that somehow kind of like put the stage or the background and achieve the stability to some extent. And then with that, of course, now the objective of this new program is to maintain that stability, but at the same time to cement that with structural reforms. And I think that's kind of like the novelty that really put the focus on the reform agenda rather than to just kind of like, achieve stability. And then in the past, often that stability would not end up with adjustment. So right now we aim to kind of like, have the adjustment there, but then really push towards structural reform over the 3 years of the program horizon. And the second point and the novelty is, and maybe just to highlight that the main objective of this reform is also, of course, to have a stronger and sustained and more inclusive growth that bottom line would help and support all the Pakistanis. And the second element that I want to highlight, and probably this is the novelty, and not only in Pakistan, also for many other countries, also to have a formal inclusion of the provinces through new national fiscal pact. And I think this was highlighted by the previous session, how this could be important. And this objective is to enable the provinces to enable their constitutional mandate to raise revenues, and also to allocate spending on critical areas, including like social spending on health, education, and also infrastructure spending. I think this is critical, and it's important in terms of having more like a broad-based and more inclusive, and also like a broader ownership of the program itself. And then this, along with the other fiscal reform that we would say, is to mobilize revenues and also to create a more fairer and also efficient taxation system that also enable the business environment, and then other reform agenda. And the third point that I want to highlight is also to kind of like on the growth agenda. So the main objective again is certainly, as I have mentioned before, is to make sure that the growth is sustained and it's more inclusive. And this could be achieved through reducing reducing distortions, reducing state interventions, and also to address import substitution, and also to remove, varieties of concession. So that would enable, to have a more resilient growth, and through, again, just to highlight, through more liberalization, through improving competitiveness, and also to really enable kind of like have a level playing field, and then to have the growth that's driven by private sector and also by export. That's kind of like supported through competition, through reducing red tapes, and etc. So that's why this would enable us to not go through this boom and bust cycle again, but really to maintain stability, and then add the reform agenda. And just to maybe highlight one more thing, and raised by previous speaker is, and maybe some of these concerns could be addressed. Again, we see that in terms of like the outlook, the recovery has been kind of like in place, and going from like a negative growth last fiscal year 2023 to positive growth in 2024. And then we expect that this positive growth momentum would continue this year and next. And then in terms of we see significant progress on the inflation side, that inflation has receded. And then again, like a significant accomplishment and progress is also improved external position, that we have a better current account balance now. The central bank has been kind of like making significant progress in terms of building buffers, and then to kind of like, address external shocks. And then I think with supported also by, of course, fiscal and the monetary policy front, in terms of like the progress on inflation agenda, that we see that, there is more commitment in terms of like really to have fiscal sustainability, to have a price sustainability and stability, and then this would also create a field for, delivering the structural reform, rather than putting the energy in terms of kind of like the effort in terms of maintaining the stability. Maybe I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mahir. We are especially grateful to Najy Benhassine, Country Director, World Bank. He seriously hurt himself a couple of days ago playing soccer. I've been telling him at his age he should take to tennis. The injuries are less serious. But thank you for joining us. He's wearing the cricket cap, not because he's a cricketer, but because to cover up the injury that he had in the soccer game. So my question will be a soft one, not to tax you too much, considering you are injured. IMF and the bank work closely together. IMF has got great tools for addressing stabilization, less so for structural reform. World Bank is much better positioned to pursue structural reforms. We know that World Bank Pakistan enjoyed a great partnership right up to the 90s. World Bank loans were fantastic project loans. Pakistan export to GDP that I just talked about, Pakistan was highest in South Asia, was partly the result of those earlier engagements with the World Bank and the excellent public investment programs that came out of that engagement. The Vice President was here recently, South Asia region for the World Bank, and he announced together with Najy a 20 billion 10-year program. So Najy, how will that program drive the structural reform agenda so that Pakistan becomes internationally competitive? And how much of your excellent report on productivity will be a part of that program?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much, Ijaz, and thanks for the Pakistan Business Council for inviting me. I should say I have many hats from different regions of Pakistan, but my team recommended this one as the one that will make unanimity in the room, hiding mascaras. But thanks for the question, Ijaz. I think this is, I'll answer your question on our new strategy. I just want to say, following the comments by Khurram and Mahir, this is really a critical time. We're often asked, will this time be different? And as Khurram put it, we're looking for signs whether this time will be different, and whether the past trend to let go and go back to inefficient policies, and Khurram mentioned the pressure of some in the private sector, but I would say also the needs to see the benefits in the population at large, which can lead to going back to inefficient spendings without addressing the core issues of the economy. And I think it's too early to tell, but the drop in inflation and the early signs are in the right direction. Big question mark is how long will it last, and will the returns in terms of private investment and productivity to destabilization, when will it come, and whether there'll be enough trust and confidence in this path for the private sector to respond. I think this is the key question, but I'm optimistic. Now, on our new engagement, I'll say a few words. The big shift in our agreement with the government is to shoot for the long term, is to have a joint commitment on a few outcomes, targeting a decade-long steady focus on a few topics. That doesn't mean we won't focus on short-term structural reform that are much needed, and I'll come to it because they're embedded in these outcomes. But let me first start by saying, and it will echo what we heard earlier from Dr. Ijaz Husain, from Senator Sharif Rahman, and many others in the panel, but there is no long-term growth and development. There's no long-term sustained productivity growth when one child out of three is out of school, when only one girl out of four, age 14 or 15, is in secondary school, when learning poverty, this term that Dr. Ijaz Husain mentioned earlier, is close to 75%, meaning 3 children out of 4 can't read an age-appropriate text. You don't have long-term development and sustained productivity growth with these outcomes, nor do you have long-term development when a large part of the population doesn't have access to clean water and sanitation services, which not only leads to waterborne diseases that reduce productivity. Productivity has been flat for the past 2 decades in Pakistan, but also sadly leads to stunting rates of 40% and much higher in certain districts, and same, flat over the past 2 decades despite the reduced poverty. Nor do you have long-term per capita growth when fertility rates are at 3.4 per woman, and the measures and the spending and the policy reforms, I'll come to it, that Bangladesh did a long time ago in this space are very low or very weak or absent, and this combined lead to the low female labor force participation rate. And I could go on. Agricultural productivity is down, and the agriculture system faces a set of prices, incentives, even property rights framework that go against productivity growth and diversification of agriculture and development of value chains, and let alone what was mentioned earlier, in particular by Senator Sharif Rahman, on the impacts of climate change. And last but not least, but these we talk more about, difficult to grow when you have regular fiscal crisis and energy system with such losses that lead to such high prices and that's very difficult to have industry grow and export with such prices. This list of topics, 6 of them, are exactly what this new engagement will focus on. 6 outcomes, about 10 targets that cover these topics until 2035. And the bet with the government is to stay focused on these. We're exiting from at least 10 sectors and 10 areas, but these won't be reached if there's no policy reforms inside each one of these. We often talk about, of course, structural reforms in the fiscal area, expenditures and revenues, energy sector reforms, business environment reforms, trade reforms, reducing protection. Country can't export with that level of protection. And this is an agenda, among others, in the business environment that's over the, I would say, 2, 3, 4 years agenda that we are working on with the IMF. But there are other policy reforms that are less on the front page today because they address less this short-term response of private investment. Take agriculture. Agriculture productivity will not increase without looking at the price structure in agriculture, the price of water, the nature of contracts in agriculture and tenancy reform, without looking at where are the subsidies going and whether they should be shifted instead of subsidizing inputs and certain categories of farmers toward more broader public goods like research and development, something that was also mentioned earlier. That's a major policy shift that is central to hope and expect to have agricultural productivity growth in a context of climate change where it's harder and harder and scarce water to see increase in productivity. And I could go on and on. The solutions to education, everybody talks about education, but Pakistan spends probably half what it should spend compared to other countries as percentage of GDP on public education. Same on health. This will require fiscal resources, which are not available today, which means addressing these disparities in access to education and health will require addressing disparities in terms of how much people, citizens and businesses contribute to raising revenues. So these topics are linked. This is health and education, same for water and sanitation. So I think all of these tie together. What could be, I mean, the bet that we're moving, that this could be a historical shift in the economic history of Pakistan, and this time is different, is not only to have a successful, sustained stabilization, early reforms on the business environment, in the trade area, and on the fiscal reforms to make more space and that for private sector, so that the private investment comes early, so that we see a boost in growth, but having this long-term view on these foundations of long-term growth, without which Pakistan won't be able to grow. This is what this quote-unquote $20 billion 10-year, and you know, this number is being often cited, but every year it's about 0.5% of GDP. In Fini, it's not that big. We have to be humble. It won't happen without policy reforms of government-owned resources, private sector contributing to it. There's many sectors on which there's opportunities, and also different partners of Pakistan aligning around these long-term objectives and good, credible long-term planning. And this is where I want to end, because I agree with Khurram on this.
Thank you, Najy. So, just to keep things in context, between the IMF and the World Bank, we have, about $3 billion a year? Remittances are $32 billion a year. Pakistan does not lack foreign exchange. It's what we do with it is what matters. What happens, our consumption to GDP ratio is 94%. It's 72% in Bangladesh and 73% in India. We are consumers. That's the shift that needs to be made. And it has to be owned by you. Because when Malia Lodi this morning said, we've got to make ourselves relevant to the world, how has Vietnam made itself relevant to the world, or Cambodia making itself relevant to the world, or Bangladesh making itself relevant to the world? It has made itself a center for manufacturing so that the world's capital can go there and use the productive workers to manufacture things for the rest of the world. That's how they made themselves relevant. And that's the relevance that we are seeking. So structural reform, so you've got stabilization. IMF is keeping a close watch on that. As Khurram said, there's a clamor to start growing again, but this will be premature growth. It'll take us back to the balance of payments crisis because the economy has not really restructured. We are still at 94% of GDP consumption. So when we grow, bulk of that growth will translate into imports and back to the balance of payments crisis. So stabilization, IMF says this time it'll be different because we'll keep a close tab on this for a longer period of time. There is the first level of structural reform, which is the government, keeping its fiscal house in order and making sure that the disincentives from exports are reduced. That's the first level of structural reform. Then there's deeper structural reform that Najy mentioned, which is, are we making our workers, both men and women workers, productive workers, so the world comes to become relevant to the world? That's the deeper structural reform. I'm summing up these conversations because I hope at the end of the day that we will be able to create some ownership of these reforms by all of you, because you have to play an extremely important role to make sure that there's no premature revival of growth and to make sure that these two layers of structural reform, the government remains committed to. The government, for its political pressures, etc., will try to get growth going earlier. But it's in your interest to make sure that that doesn't happen. I'm going to now turn to Reza Baqir, who knows the economy as well as anybody else, who has seen through the stabilization programs and has dealt with many world economies on how to combine structural reform and stabilization. Knows the Philippines very well. He was at the IMF for many, many years and was representative of the IMF in the Philippines. And he'll tell us about how other countries have done the same thing and how they have created these two layers of structural reform so that they become relevant to the world. Reza, over to you.
Dr. Saab, Assalamu alaikum. First, if you could tell me if you can hear me, so I can.
Yes, we can hear you well.
Are you able to hear me? Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Let me thank BBC for the invitation. Let me say I really regret that I can't be with you in person. Would have liked to, but travel plans came in the way. But I've really enjoyed the discussion so far and very much agree with all the points that have been made by the panelists. So I thought, Dr. Saab, that I could add to the discussion on 3 points. The first is to maybe build upon what you said, Dr. Saab, with regards to our macroeconomic history and the current account deficits. The second point with regards to structural reforms. And I wanted to try to share with everybody what we try to put together here, a scorecard on recent structural reforms. How much have we done over the last, say, 2 IMF programs, the one that I can count starting from 2019? And what does it say about the structural agenda going forward? What lessons do we learn from it? And the third point is, Ijaz, as you mentioned, how have other countries broken out of this cycle? Because other countries have broken out of the cycle of being a prolonged user of IMF resources. Pakistan, unfortunately, has not. So what do those lessons show us? So on the first point, and I want to share something with you as well. And Dr. Saab, just let me know if you can share this, if you can see the screen. Are you able to see the screen? I'll wait for your cue because I can't hear you unless you mic.
Reza, we can see you on the screen. Thank you.
You can see the chart. You can see the title slide.
Yes.
Okay. So, Dr. I want to come to the macro point. And if you can see this chart, this is a long-term relationship between two indicators that, to me, hold a lot of the secrets to our repeated boom-bust cycles. The line in dark black is our primary budget deficit, which means the fiscal position excluding interest payments, because interest payments are non-discretionary, they're out of our control. We have to make interest payments. The other line is the current account deficit. Now, the point I really want to make is that the biggest driver, Dr. Saab, you said we get IMF programs because we get current account deficits, but we also have to ask our questions. If you had to pick one biggest driver of what is our current account deficits, it's very simple, and it is our budget deficit. And repeatedly, more or less, except for maybe one incident, and I'll tell you why that may be slightly different, more or less whenever we have blown the deficits, we have blown the current account deficit. Whenever our budget deficit has deteriorated, our current account deficit has deteriorated, and vice versa. And Dr. you mentioned that the way to have external stabilization is to kill growth. That's what IMF programs do. I would nuance that a bit. I don't think IMF programs are designed to kill growth. I think all they do is what we could not do ourselves, which is to keep fiscal policy prudent. And if we can keep our fiscal policy prudent, we don't really need to go back to the IMF, period. Now, maybe one or two areas where this relationship is not as strong. If you look at 2008, 2009 onwards, there's a little bit of difference when our current account balance improves, but our fiscal balance steadily deteriorates. And the big missing variable here, which you can't plot too many things, is oil prices. Because oil prices, our oil import bill is a large part of our current account deficit. And that's a period when oil prices collapsed. And this was right after the global financial crisis. You might even remember at one point, oil prices were trading just a few dollars. And that really accounts for that. So my main point that I really want to convey here is when people ask about whether the current foreign exchange stability will prevail, I think it will, so long as the fiscal deficit remains in control. And if you look at, in fact, the most recent reversal that we had in fiscal year 21-22, you will see that there was a fiscal expansion of about 2% of GDP that wiped out the previous 2 years' gains. And it's no surprise then you see that the current account deficit then also blows out. So my simple answer on the first point is simply, if we maintain the current responsible fiscal policy, we'll maintain foreign exchange stability as well. But this is so much about macro. I think this is well treaded ground, so I won't say much more. But really, what I want to then turn to is a scorecard on structural. We all agree that a good macro and a prudent fiscal is a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition for long-term growth and stability. But when it comes to structural, how do we figure out whether we are making progress or we are not making progress? So for the purposes of this talk, together with a former IMF employee, we looked at the last two programs with the IMF, the 2019 Extended Fund Facility and the 2023 SBA. And we compiled all the structural benchmarks and all the prior actions. And this is a long list. I don't expect you to read it, but it goes over 2 pages. And in total, there are 47 such structural benchmarks and prior actions. The only thing we exclude is macro measures such as taxes or interest rates, purely fiscal or purely monetary in the sense of interest rates or exchange rate. And what we come is with a list of 47 such measures. And the color coding here is that everything that's in green is either a structural benchmark that is met either at the particular review that it was destined to, or even if with a little bit of delay, but within the program. The measures in yellow on this first slide are those which were not met in that program, but were met in the subsequent program. As you know, there was a caretaker government during the 2023 SBA, and there was a time to rush through many measures that could not be done before. So what does this list of 47 structural benchmarks and reforms tell us about how well are we doing on structural reforms? And there are a few takeaways for me, at least. This is a summary of everything that I've showed you so far. If you look at the bottom panel, it's simply the reforms by sector, whether it's structural reforms in the monetary and fiscal. The green shows if they were met in the course of the program, the yellow if they were met in the subsequent program, and the orange shows if they were not met. So overall, there were 47 measures that I told you in these two programs. Out of these, 37 were either met in the program or in the program right afterwards. Okay, so that's about 80% that were met. But I think the puzzle, at least for many people, for me at least, is we are still at a place where we all say, including the international financial institutions, that structural reforms are the key impediment to Pakistan's long-term sustainability and growth. So I want to pause here and at least share some takeaways, and I think this really is designed more to get us to think rather than to give answers, which is, how do we define those few structural measures that we all can agree on that will give the path to sustained growth and recovery? Maybe a list of 47 is too long. And maybe when we have too long a list, we dilute it. And I would really challenge ourselves to pin down maybe what are those, say, 5 to 10 measures that we can all count on our fingertips. And we can all agree that these are the ones that will really make a difference to us. It's sobering. That's the message that I take. And what I would very much want is कि ऐसा ना हो कि आज से 3 साल बाद, when this program ends, somebody does a similar scorecard and we figure out that we completed yet another maybe 20, 30 structural benchmarks. And even then commentators are saying that structural reforms are the key impediment. If you ask my view, I think, to unpack the structure side needs proactive government policy. There is a school of thought which says that if you just get macro right, everything else will happen on its own. I, for one, not a fan of that view. I think countries that have demonstrated that despite challenging initial conditions, they have now done very well. Countries like China, many others, they have had a very activist policy to support certain sectors. And in Pakistan, we always talk about exports, but it's unclear what all we do very specifically to support them. And I'm not a fan of defining sectors. Any sector that can export, and it's very easy to measure exports because they drop in our banking system, should be supported. And if anything, new sectors should be encouraged over and above the entrenched export sectors. But what are those specific things? This is really a challenge. So this brings me to my last point, which is how do we get a consensus around structural reforms? And, there is a refrain amongst many commentators of just looking to the government. That, okay, the government is falling short and the government is not defining the reform agenda. That is very true. But in many countries, it is the broader stakeholders that come together. And this is my third point on the Philippines. So I used to be there 2005 to 2008. 2005, it was very similar to Pakistan, big fiscal deficits, current account deficits, large debt. And, the IMF back then was thinking that any time they'll ask for an IMF program. In the event, Philippines pulled off a very remarkable turnaround. There was no IMF program. And what really triggered it was that a group of 21 Filipino economists, not the government, not the international financial institutions, but a group of Philippine economists came together. And they put together a white paper for the reforms that the Philippines economy needs. It's not rocket science. But the fact that they all came together, they put it forward, it had the ownership such that a government, even though it was concerned about its political popularity, was able to follow it because it was truly, really a homegrown program. So my really ending point, Dr. Saab, is that in Pakistan, we have many, many talented economists. We have many good think tanks as well. We have to find a way that we come together and we define a simple structural reform agenda, things that we can count on our fingertips, and that would have ownership across all the parties, all the domestic stakeholders to take it forward. So let me just end there with, I wanted to share with you a few thoughts around macro, a brief scorecard on fiscal, and then to just end by saying that when we look at the experience of other countries, it's really their own economists and other policy, their other analysts who come together to drive change going forward. Thank you.